Okay. Gotta put on my mic, although I'm not sure it makes much of a difference. In this podcast, I want to talk about the rise of Hitler and what he was up to and what he believed. And I think the first thing I want to say is something that's pretty obvious, but it can't be said enough. Hitler really believed the stuff he put out there about the superior race, about the fact that Jews needed to be, by the 1940s, exterminated, the need to capture parts of the Soviet Union to create living space for the German people. He was a fanatic that had very clear ideas about and stated very clearly what his goals were. But this is, and I think this is one of the things that Roberts talks about. Hitler was so dogmatic, and as I've said a couple times, he doesn't have a stop button, that it ultimately trips him up. And it's one of the reasons that he loses World War II. Nazis could very easily be in power in Germany today if they hadn't been so expansionist. But they were. Hitler didn't know when to stop. Whereas Stalin, who's a monster on the scale of Hitler, did know when to stop. Didn't push. Was less dogmatic, although, of course, he's dealing under a system which is just as totalitarian communism as were the Nazis. But Stalin was a little bit saner, in a way, in the sense of his national interest. Whereas Hitler just pushed and pushed and pushed. And he pushes so far that ultimately, after a lot of war and blood and destruction, he's defeated. But he sets himself up for defeat in some ways by his inability to stop. So the fascism, Hitler is a fascist, and fascism is an ideology that that developed in the 1920s. The first promulgator of fascism was Benito Mussolini, who is kind of a joke in retrospect, but at the time was very serious. He kind of sets the stage for Hitler in a lot of ways. And what do fascists believe? Well, very, very thumbnail sketch. They believe in a very strong central government and a strict control of industry and the people. Now, this isn't communism, though. In a fascist environment, there is still room for private ownership of property, private ownership of the production of goods. Whereas in communism, there's no room for that whatsoever. And it's one of the key differences between the two. So there still is, to a certain extent, a private sector under fascism. But certainly it's a private sector that's very constrained by the needs of the state, by the needs of the central government. Fascism is also a reaction to the perceived failure of free market economics. That if the state somehow controls or guides private industry without actually taking control over industry, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, that it would create a situation of a higher employment and a more stable society. Fascism was highly militaristic. Tied to that, it was also highly nationalistic. It was driven by a sense of very belligerent nationalism that encouraged conflict and war as a means of social improvement and as a way of increasing the power of the state in the world stage. So militaristic, highly nationalistic, these things were very closely tied together. It's driven also by intense state propaganda. The state is constantly telling Germans, I'm talking about Germany now, I think Mussolini was much less successful in this propaganda. Hitler is constantly monitoring German public opinion. He's constantly trying to have Germans think a certain kind of way. He indoctrinates children very, very easily with organizations such as Hitler Youth. Education is very much under the thumb of the state. So one of the tenets of fascism is that you had a fairly effective state control over propaganda manipulation. Now, I talked about one of the differences between Germany and our society. I talked about ethnicity, where ethnicity isn't so central to becoming an American citizen. One of the other differences between Europe and the U.S., Germany and the U.S., the state in Germany is a much more respected entity. The federal government, the central government in Germany, is a much more respected entity than the federal government in the United States. The U.S. is a nation that was started by a revolution in some ways against government, King George III. And this distrust of the state, of federal government, is pretty deep into the DNA of Americans. Also, there are many vectors of power in the United States, a balance of power in the federal government, but also the states have powers reserved for them as well. Counties, local officials have powers reserved for them as well. So there's a sharing of power in the United States that you don't necessarily have in Germany. And there's also, like I say, a feeling of basic trust and respect for the state in Germany that you don't have in the U.S. This is one of the reasons that I think why it's not impossible that you would have a Hitler in the U.S. It's really highly unlikely. We're just set up so differently. But anyway, that's another conversation. So this is one of the other things that explains what I think seems very mysterious to many Americans. Why would the Germans support this guy who basically destroyed their country and was responsible for the murder of millions? Why did they support him back in the day? Why couldn't they see what he was up to? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and I've talked about this, and I'm going to talk about this some more. But the propaganda is one of the things as well. They're being fed this propaganda by an entity, the central government, that they trust more than Americans trust their central government. In the U.S., propaganda, most propaganda anyway, the most effective, as we saw in Casablanca, came from the private sector, was much more organic. So what you had was the rise of fascism, first of all in Italy, and then beginning in the 1920s, Adolf Hitler, who was a veteran of World War I, who actually had fought very, very effectively in World War I, comes into power or starts creating a Nazi party that promulgates this sense of fascism. And now I want to talk about what Hitler's thinking was, what his philosophy was. And he did have a guiding philosophy. But you know what? I'm 8 minutes into this podcast. I think I'm going to stop here. 10 minutes is kind of the maximum for these effective YouTube podcasts. I guess I can make them longer. Also, I think students get bored after a certain point. So anyway, the point being, I'm going to stop here, and then in the next podcast, talk about Hitler's philosophy and what his version of fascism was.